Muted.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Facility Phase 2 Kickoff Plenary webinar. We're going to give an overview for everyone here, and looks like we have about 77 attendees on the line, so we're glad to see everyone with us. So here are just some quick logistics before we get started with the go-to meeting. Every attendee is entered in listen-only mode. So while we run through the presentation, you will be muted. But when we get to the questions section, or if you have a question, please feel free to chat in your questions. And I will either unmute your mic so you can ask the question to the presenters, or you can chat me your question and I will forward it to them. The agenda for the call today will be a background on Facility IPT Phase 1, showing kind of where we're coming from, Facility Team Phase 2 introduction, sort of the broader outline of that, the 6 work streams from Facility Phase 2, team structure and communications of Phase 2, milestones, and then opportunities to participate. So now I'll turn it over to the Facility Team Phase 2 co-chairs.
Hi guys, my name is Joshua Calthus. I'm with the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. I am one of the co-chairs of this group, along with Regina, Ron, and Susan. Do you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure, I'm Regina Crawley. I'm from the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control.
Ron Evans from EPA, the Office of Air and Radiation.
And Susan Jones-Smiley from EPA's Office of Environmental Information.
Yay! So that's the 4 of us. Anytime you guys have any questions or any concerns about anything, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to help in any way we can. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to cover some material about the general information and the background briefly. Of the 4 of us, I was the person chosen to go over Phase 1 material because I had the most overlap with that, even though I wasn't as immersed as some other people that were involved with Phase 1. But this first slide is covering just e-enterprise broadly and giving you a little bit of an idea of where the facility team falls within the e-enterprise structure. There's a lot of things going on within e-enterprise in general, and I kind of wanted to provide this to give you some insight and a good way to connect dots between what's happening within enterprise. The facility team, which is what we are specifically, is looking at integration across EPA programs with facility information, and it does overlap or feed into some work happening in other programs within enterprise, such as combined air emissions reporting. It's going to tie a little bit into the integrated identity solution project because identities tie into facility and responsibilities, things of that nature. Yeah, next slide. So for the background on the facility team, which was previously called the Facility IPT, which stood for Integrated Project Team, Phase 1 began about, I think, a year and a half ago now, and during that phase there was some information gathering about facility topics in general. Now, during that time, they kind of did a general outreach at first to look at things broadly across different programs, different states, different locals and tribals were available, and kind of just catalog some of those existing partner systems, some of the unique nuances that exist with all of those programs. Once they gathered some of that information, they reviewed a bit of it, and then they conducted a few deep dives with 3 states specific to master facility management and master data management at those states. There's like a spectrum of master facility management across the nation, and the states that were looked at were the states that had more advanced or more inclusive master facility management schemes in place. I can't remember all 3 of them. I know New Jersey, Wyoming, There's a third one that always escapes me. I can never remember it. And then Texas, which wasn't a deep dive participant, but they also provided some information to the Phase 1 team, were all very valuable insight. So once that was looked at and gathered, some information, it essentially compared and contrasted, trying to identify things that were common across them all. And then the outcome was a document which distilled all that information from Phase 1 and kind of passed it on to Phase 2. Next slide, please. So one of the ideas that kind of came out of Phase 1 is that the components for a common vision for the facility, it needs to implement or to enable e-enterprise goals broadly. The facility integration needs to be integration and correction of data in as near real time as possible. Near time integration may not be possible. It might be in some instances, but in order to have things done accurately and efficiently, it needs to be as real time as possible. Common facility profile model that allows varying levels of granularity. This is just because various e-enterprise projects are going to be relying on facility integration and have varying needs. The shared business rules and mapping to a common enough terminology. Common enough here is really meaning that even though we may have different words that reference the same idea across the states, essentially that information is the same. Now there are a lot of nuances, a lot of intricacies that exist between programs that have to be addressed. That's not really the common enough terminology that it's speaking about. It's saying where things are known to be the same, it's just we're using different words. Also, for supporting facility integration, APIs are going to be needed, and they need to be flexible enough to work with EPAs, states, other systems. In other words, it has to be able to meet everyone's needs. And then also, finally, just having good practices and tools, something that everyone agrees upon, something that's easily identified and outlined and understandable to all. Next slide. So Phase 2, there was a meeting, forget what point in time it was at this, but it was like a bridge between Phase 1 and Phase 2, happened in DC. It was sponsored by ECOAST and or hosted by ECOAST and several participants from EPA and the co-chairs at the time. The purpose of that was the purpose of Phase 2 is to move further forward based on Phase 1 findings, and specifically to bridge the disparate sources of the facility. The facility being facility broadly across programs. Ideally, it's going to allow regulated facilities to streamline data collection and reporting, provide a shared facility ID approach. If you're involved with Phase 1 or have seen this presentation before, you most likely already are aware of this information. The focus of Phase 2 is collecting state, local, tribal, industry, and EPA input through various webinars, outreaches, meetings, to get information on how we can share facility identifiers, correct the data as it's being reported on the front side as opposed to having to do it on the back end and cleaning it up, and then facilitate a lot of the other things within enterprise, such as combined emissions reporting, etc. Next slide. The goals specific to the Phase 2 work are ambitious and important. It's pretty straightforward. We want to help everyone be more efficient and more effective, to get things done more quickly and for them to be more accurate. That is not a small task, but it is an important one. So if we help programs and agencies manage their responsibilities more efficiently, to do that, we have to get facility integration figured out. To reduce industry reporting burden, we have to be sure that we do it correctly. To assemble more quickly the multimedia environmental data, we have to be sure that we're enabling the programs that rely upon facility integration to reference the facility integration protocols or items in place to be able to fully support those programs. And then last two, just provide the public a complete, consistent understanding of facilities and the regulatory environment, and then just increase accuracy in general. Next slide. So the goal outcomes for phase 2 is coming up with a core set of information, which is the facility profile, something that carries across programs, so that no matter what your perspective is, you're always able to identify what specific facility you're talking about. Come up with not necessarily the solution suite needed, but a definition of what that suite would require to have, to be able to support facility integration. And then documentation of the governance decisions required to implement solutions set. There's going to have to be some decisions made along the way within the existing regulatory framework about who owns what data, who's responsible for what data, how the data gets changed, who the stewards are, things of that nature. And coming to a consensus on that, and then documenting clearly why that decision was made or why that decision was needed is going to be important. And with that, I will turn it over to Ron.
All right, if we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Josh. This is going to be a long process, I think is the best way to describe it. What the phase 1 showed us is there's a lot of different activities that we need to consider, some of which that Josh just went over. And what we're doing here within phase 2 is trying to break down some of these pieces into things that are both helpful initially in addressing many questions, but also setting up for the development of a more complete interaction between the federal systems that use facility ID and the state systems. And what happened in phase 1 is that they developed a variety of different things that they thought was a good way to start. And what you see here on this page is the 6 work streams that we're going to use from them and move forward with phase 2. And what I'm planning to do is use the next few slides to walk through the activities of our facility team and what each of these is going to cover in a nutshell. And just a little bit of shameless promoting here. We still need help on all of these. So as we're going through this, if you see something that's attractive, please follow up with us, and maybe you can participate as well. The final thing that I want to say on this particular page is that nothing we're doing on any of these teams will be a completed effort at the end. It's all going to be a work in progress. Each one is going to build on each other. We are going to certainly have things we can point to at the end of this process in terms of something well-defined, but as I said, this is going to be something that does take time and a lot of iteration. If I could have the next slide, please. So user stories are where we go ahead and collect many different components, where we hear from the EPA staff and the programs on how they use facility information, from the states or from industry representatives on how they input facility information, how they use it. And the user stories is where we try and collect that information and to go ahead and be able to start addressing some of the issues that are developed. Phase 1 is providing us with the kickoff point, if you will, in terms of some of these things that we want to investigate. Under phase 2, there's going to be an additional process of collecting user stories, gathering information of how stakeholders collect and store and use the facility information as a base for all the other activities that we'll be moving forward with. And the idea here is that these user stories will be documented and prioritized to allow us to go ahead as a team to try and think about those things that have the broadest impact first. If we could turn to the next page. One of the things that Josh emphasized a moment ago is the business rules. And the business rules I consider as the heart of this effort, because it's all well and good to have a bunch of information that can be shared, but the business rules are those things, that the agreements between all the actors on how things will be treated, how things will be decided, and what the definitions, if you will, are for the individual pieces. And so what we're doing under this team is to go ahead and develop those business rules and figure out the process for the general agreement on those business rules that'll make the system work. So it's got to be something that is going to work for the EPA programs, the state programs, and the industry people as well, so we have a common understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to move forward. So the first step for us here is that we're going to identify and develop high-level shared business rules. And concurrently, we expect to see governance requirements. How will we be able to develop a process for approval of these is probably some of the earliest things that we'll see. One of the things that we're going to be able to rest on is that we already have a model that's been populated by one of our more detailed AIR programs, our emission inventory program. And that's going to serve as the base for the development of a lot of these decision rules. We thought by going ahead and having some sort of straw man that we could work against would help us be able to work through the business rules using live cases as opposed to theory, if you will. One of the final things I want to say in this slide is emphasized in this last line here about working closely with the other sub-teams to ensure shared learning. Here, there's going to be a lot of interactions. As these other teams work on their projects, they're going to see a place for a business rule. They will come back to this business rules team and put it in our bin to be able to help figure out how it's going to fit and how it fits with all the other components. The next slide, please. So this next team is going to be where the business rules are sort of tested out, if you will, in a broad way. And this gets into a bit of the testing of the system itself. EPA, as part of this process that you'll hear about this a little bit later in this presentation, has developed a facility ID data model. And that's EPA's contribution to this process. We think we've developed a flexible system that EPA and the states will be able to use interactively to the extent that a state would want to come in and be able to use it. And this team is going to go ahead and look at EPA's model as a base, work with it, and consider how the EPA model could share information using APIs with states and back and forth for that, to start thinking through some of the processes for sharing of information between EPA programs and state programs, recognizing that there are legacy programs, there have been investments on both sides that we need to take into account as we're thinking about sharing this information. And API is a nice computer term. It's basically a way for to share the information back and forth. And so I'll move on to the next slide if I could. Now, one of the things that we're doing and taking advantage of what's happened in the past, There's a separate program, project under E-Enterprise called CARE. And what's going on there is that we're trying to go ahead and pull together 4 different EPA programs plus input from the states who supply a lot of information on emission inventories to EPA from industry, and working together to develop a common air emissions reporting program. An important component of that is the shared facilities information. And as a result of the work by the CARE team and working closely with the new EPA facility registry data model, we've populated that with the information, the emissions information at a fairly detailed level. And this is allowing our facilities team here to use that as a test bed. And so to some degree, that work in populating the new EPA facility model is complete. And now under this team, what's going to happen is we're going to work with a volunteer state, in this case South Carolina, to see how the information that's been populated from the care information has been populated into this new facility model, and how that will work with South Carolina and what they're doing now. And one of the things that we've focused on here is that South Carolina is using something called SLICE, which is the State and Local Emissions Inventory System. And what we're hoping to do is use that as a model and develop an API that for the sharing of information between the new EPA data model and the SLICE system, which would allow us to develop in relatively rapid fashion, we hope, something that could permit the exchange of information between the APA system and 14 different state and local agencies who are using SLICE. So that was why we picked that as one of the test beds, if you will. The next slide, please. Now we know there's a variety of sophistication from and investment from the states that are going to use this system. There's some that have very mature systems, and they have their own master data management system. And what we're going to do under this particular work stream is focus on thinking about how the EPA model could work with a state who has a very sophisticated system, if you will, and how those two systems could work together so that we can, through this overall project, we can take advantage of the knowledge and investment that a state has put into the development of a master data management system, and be able to then share that information with EPA through its new system, but also to think about some of the interaction considerations between a mature state system and where EPA is going with its. So it's a matter of thinking in a sort of one-on-one basis, if you will, how we can get the EPA system to play with a state master data management system in a cooperative fashion, if you will. The final team, if I can have the next slide, recognizes that there are states and other localities or tribal organizations that haven't made the investment in a sophisticated system at this point, or are thinking about doing that now. And what we're looking for through this team is to be able to go ahead and possibly jumpstart or the phrase used here is to bootstrap a state or local or tribal program and figure out ways that they could actually use the EPA system, facility ID system directly, so that they wouldn't have to make a separate investment in some sort of facility ID system, something that would allow them to go ahead and use the EPA system to work with what they have already. And so these last two have been, if you will, almost poles of the range of experience and sophistication of the state systems that we're hoping through these two we will be able to start developing solutions that will meet all types of different states' needs. And what I want to do now is turn it over to Susan Joan so she can continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Ron. Next slide, please. So Ron described the 6 different work streams, and I want to talk about the team structure and communication and how we're going to, throughout the process, continue outreach and involvement of the states, tribes, other organizations, other stakeholders. Each work stream will have broad representation. We work as virtual teams via webinar and conference calls. We have representation from multiple EPA program offices as well as multiple states. We've discussed a number of them here that have been involved, as well as ECOS and Exchange Network representatives. And hopefully folks on the call will join some of the one or more of the work streams as we continue moving forward. We have a weekly co-chair call to coordinate all the work stream activities and to monitor progress. We have a very proactive communication strategy for stakeholder engagement and for seeking continuous input throughout the process. So on the next slide, this illustrates the, I don't expect y'all to read this, I know it's very small, but across the bottom of the slide you see the time period from where we kicked off phase 2 in August through June of next summer. This is the time period of the phase 2 work, and you see the swim lanes, if you will, of the various 6 work streams and how they are concurrent yet interactive. And on the next slide, which is really complex, and I really don't expect you to be able to read, but what this illustrates is the iterative processes and the interconnectedness between the work streams. So as draft products go out for review, you see some deliverables identified on the far right of this chart. As those deliverables go out for review, we'll take feedback from those and feedback to the other work streams. So we're fixing to release an initial draft version of user stories, and we'll take feedback from that and feed that to the business rule team. As the APIs are developed and implemented throughout the process, we'll identify additional business rules, which will then feed back to the business rules, which will morph into the governance issues that come out on the results of the pilots as we identify those things that need, governance decisions moving forward. So there again, a lot of detail on this slide, but it's meant to illustrate the iterative nature of the process. And on the next slide, as they form our comprehensive and understandable view of the major milestones for the phase 2 work. So kicked off in July, we started working in August with the initial user story. The intent is to have sort of an 80% draft in the next week for a broader review, so hopefully folks on this call can engage with us in the review of that and refinement of those user stories, and to turn that over to the business rule group that will continue to refine those into the processes that will feed into the API development. And the pilot work with South Carolina will begin in November after the release of the new data model in FRS. And the new year will bring the beginning of the state pilots, the additional pilots, which we are still recruiting participation in. So the goal is to get some initial findings from this work to present at the the Exchange Network Conference in Philadelphia in May. And so with the next slide, there are a number of dependencies in order to proceed effectively with the phase 2 work. The primary one is stakeholder engagement. So thank you for joining us today and expressing your interest in this work. We're looking for additional pilot participants, And as Ron mentioned, the new data model, and Matt Kelly's going to talk about that in a minute. The refinements to EPA's facility model, which will enable a lot of this work. And with that, I'd like to introduce Matt Kelly from EPA's Office of Environmental Information to talk about FRS, which is one of the EPA's contribution to the discussion about facility and how we're going to build on some of that work moving forward and begin with some definitional stuff. So with that, next slide, and Matt.
Thank you, Susan Joan. I appreciate the introduction, and wanted to, of course, reemphasize that this is definitely EPA's contribution to the enterprise, and we're looking to grow this program along with the needs that are communicated in these projects like combined air emissions as well as the facility IPT. So just wanted to give a real brief overview of what FRS is for those who might not be familiar with it. So it's been around for at least a decade and a half at this point, and so it essentially integrates facility data across the agency and state systems and other federal agencies. We also provide improvement to those data that we integrate. So we have automated processes that help geocode locations based on an address, or we also have a tool that does data quality work for facility that's been integrated into FRS, and we also then provide that data back out to other platforms like Echo and EnviroFacts, as well as public search pages and many other places. So that's really the gist of it. We look to link facilities and geospatial data across programs, states, tribes, and other federal agencies. And to do that, we really use it on 3 different fields in particular, so the address of the facility, the name of the facility, and the location of the facility. So on the next slide, we essentially put some high-level use cases out there. So FRS helps a user identify certain permits and regulations that may pertain to a particular facility, and it kind of gives a more comprehensive view of what might be going on at a given location. So we also provide the location of a particular facility, and if we only have the address, then we have, as I mentioned, a suite of tools that helps geocode and kind of put that pin on a map for a given facility. And then it also provides some analysis for regulated facilities within a particular sector. So we've got, I think, facilities associated with over a million facilities associated with NAICS codes that can help a user find, trends within a given sector. So the FRS data that we integrate is also used for enforcement purposes. We're integrated with ISIS and ECHO. We're also supporting the rulemaking, reporting, analysis, and emergency response processes. So those are just kind of some of the different uses for FRS data. And so on the next slide, we have just some general figures on what FRS integrates. So we integrate about 33 EPA program systems. We have 54 state systems in FRS, and we have a link there to our presence on the Exchange Network. There's a product that was developed about a decade and a half ago called the FAC ID flow, and it was actually the product of a similar effort about 15 years ago. We also integrate data from 4 tribal systems and 8 systems from other federal agencies. So on the next 2 slides, it's essentially an eye chart here. I wouldn't expect you all to be able to see it very clearly, but here's just an example of some inbound data flows and sources that lead to FRS. So you can see some major buckets there, such as state facility databases, ISIS, which integrates state NIPD's data and air data, and then we also have integration with EnviroFacts, and then we also have some other cool projects going on at the bottom of the screen, the front-end integration API, which corrects data as it's reported to EPA programs. And we currently have about, I think, 11 applications in production that uses some sort of facility lookup widget on the front end to increase data quality as it's reported to EPA. And so on the next slide, we just have a diagram showing all the different places that FRS data ends up. So you can see one of the major ones is, of course, EnviroFacts, where we're integrated with other environmental interest data. We also have, other presence on intranet pages. There's intranet version of FRS for sensitive data that might not be appropriate for public consumption. And then, of course, just as I mentioned before, the FRS lookup API that helps correct data as it's reported to EPA. That can be found on the left-hand side of the diagram. So just wanted to give you guys just a quick lay of the land here, and I'd be willing to send this out to individuals if you're interested after the call. If you want to hang it on your office wall like I've done, then yeah, that would be appropriate. So on the next slide, it really keys in on the EPA's contribution to e-enterprise and efforts like this, and we've been collecting these requirements for quite a while. We didn't really start in earnest until about 1.5 years ago when we met with certain subject matter experts from the Office of Air. And it really just kind of reinforced some common issues that we have with the old facility data model. So FRS before treated everything as a facility, and it didn't matter if it was actually an outfall pipe or a stack or a boiler or whatever the more granular level of detail it is. Everything was kind of summed up at the facility level, so you lost a heck of a lot of context to what the actual facility was, what was going on at that facility. So as some programs collect, more granular level of data as it relates to a facility, the FRS data model needed to evolve with it. So, and we also then needed to provide a way to associate and store attribute data for those sub-facility components. So if a program collects lat longs for a boiler, the model previously could not accommodate that, but now it will be able to. And so then we also need to be able to provide tools to perform master data management on the new model, and also take advantage of some improvements we've made in organization and contact data as it relates to the components at a given facility. So the second bullet here keys in on the concept of an e-enterprise profile and the requirements that the FRS model needs to meet to support more granular facility reporting. So kind of what I just alluded to right there. The new model will also provide more robust history data, and we've got a couple different ways we'll be doing that. One is just by general tracking and retrieving of dates for update dates, create dates, delete dates, but also if we're able to integrate data that more adequately describes that component. So maybe the online date for a boiler at a given facility, if we can integrate that data, then we could then provide it back out and provide a better historical context to the facility and how it might have changed over time, and our regulatory focus might have changed over time. And the last bullet there is improved capabilities between FRS and CDX. So we have a separate effort going on to try to understand both data models and bring them closer together, so that if you register in CDX, then perhaps it would lean on a kind of a central organization list that could help the CDX side of the house, so that they don't have duplicate organizations being registered over and over and over, which is a bit of a problem for them at this point. So those are some of the drivers for the new data model, and on the next slide you're going to see a diagram that we worked on with the Combined Air Emissions group, and it really is the visualization of the level of granularity we're looking to support with this new data model. So you see across the top of each of these pictures is just a general title. So those are the components where it can be a site, a unit, a process, a control, a release point. These are the components that we've identified that meet the combined air emissions needs. And so there are other types of components out there for other media, and that we'll be evaluating over the next years and integrating into this new data model. And also, importantly, are the attributes below for each of them. And these attributes, they do share common traits across the board, but also they have more unique attributes that describe that component at a more granular level. So the new data model supports the integration of the data and its attributes, and then of course the association to other programs or versions or other states' versions of these components and attributes. So on the next slide, we have just the, I guess, really brief overview of how FRS has been involved with e-enterprise up to this point. And so really that's kind of our tagline at the top, is we need to build and maintain associations between facilities and their sub-facility components, contacts, corporate parents, and this all supports the e-enterprise vision in one way or another. So the first bullet there is a project that was concluded about a year ago, actually. We demoed the FRS lookup widget in the portal at the Exchange Network Conference in October of 2015. And so we're already in there, and we're excited to explore with the portal team future uses of the facility lookup widget and how it might support the future vision of the portal itself. So we have a network of data stewards. We have about 170 data stewards who provide data curation on master facility data within FRS, and these are regional staff. We do have a couple state staff in there, and we also have EPA program staff that are all providing data quality work to facility data. And the last one is the development of the new data model, which we're slated to go live on November 10th with, with some accompanying tools like our facility linkage application, our data quality tool in FRS, and the new data model will enable the use of a persistent facility identifier. And I think that might be a conversation for another day. But the next slide really highlights some requirements that were kind of nailed down with the Combined Air Emissions Work Group, and it really talked about what shared facilities must do. And this really keys in on what I provided an overview on earlier with the drivers of the new data model. But here's just some good examples of how the new model needs to support combined air emissions, and I'll just point out a couple as an example. So the supporting of a movable facility. So this is the idea that a facility can have a temporal location aspect, so that it's maybe one day it is at a certain coordinate, and then a year later when it's reported on again, it's at another location. The facility name and the facility name might be different or the same, but that location is different. So the new model will be able to handle the temporal aspect of location. And I do want to point out at the bottom there are just how shared facilities needs to work, and really there's some keys that we kind of have taken as principles that we would like to make sure that any sort of tools or model improvements that we make in the future are kind of adhered to, and one of which is the permit process and delegated authority to states needs to be respected. And like I said, the solutions and model need to reflect that. And of course, the last one there is fee-based processes must have no negative impact, so we don't want it to hurt your bottom line. And so we understand that any solution we develop jointly will need to have really robust capabilities and really consistent capabilities. So that's about it for the facility side of the house, and I believe Regina now will then be able to talk about some opportunities to participate in the phase 2.
Thanks, Matt. We hope that at this point in our presentation we've really captured your interest, and we'd like to offer you some information about opportunities for your participation in this activity. We are actively recruiting participants for both the MDM state and Bootstrap state, local, tribal pilots. If you don't feel you can commit that level of effort to our team, we also have 2 other options for your participation. We'd like workstream participants that really just are focused on providing us input as we produce draft deliverables. And we also offer you the option of collaborating with us as we share our information on our eEnterprise SharePoint site. You can review our deliverables, provide us feedback and comments, check on the status, and even check up on upcoming events so you can stay in the know. Okay, let's go to the next slide. One of the questions that we've been asked about this pilot and this level of participation is, what are the benefits that a state would receive, a state, local, or tribal entity that participates in this? Well, here's a set of those. In general, you would hope to receive a more accurate cross-functional view of the status of facility, even across various programs, air, water, land. You would be provided a more holistic view of that information and be able to prepare better analysis and understand impacts, improved accuracy and quality. And through the pilots and the API activity, we hope to demonstrate what are some of the ways that this could impact the state in a positive manner, and also understand what are some more requirements, as was mentioned earlier, that we need to feed back as business rules and government activities to make this the most effective option for folks. We hope to test some different tools and approaches and make some recommendation about what works well, what doesn't work well, And this also will give you an awareness as a participant into how other states approach their business and how other states might have addressed problems with solutions. So there'll be a learning opportunity here for each state to provide input to other states that might affect them in other ways beyond the pilot. An analysis of pilot results would include technical barriers, solutions, and metrics, as well as our concept for governance. So all of these would be benefits that we perceive at this point from our pilots, and I'm sure this list will grow. But what's in it for you? This is another question that we've been asked. We really think that this is your opportunity to shape the functionality of the future. This is your opportunity to define linkages that you would believe are necessary for you to improve your work at your state. And it's a forum where you can interact with other states as well as the EPA technical staff to talk about detailed issues. So we believe this has broad-based benefits as well as something's in it for you. And I'll open the floor now for questions.
All right, thanks to all the co-chairs for the presentations. We've got a few questions written in on the questions function in your GoTo webinar. You can either write me, the moderator, your question and I can pass it along, or you can send me a request to unmute you and ask the question directly. So the first question we have is, what specifically is involved in being a pilot participant?
And this is one of our most asked questions at this point. Some element of your time. The pilots really will involve some prep work beginning in November, October timeframe, and participation in our weekly call sets and participation in sharing and updating information and deliverables on our SharePoint site. So that's pretty much a virtual team participation, and that's a few hours a week. However, if you are a pilot participant, we would expect to see that level of effort rise up beginning somewhat in January and probably at its heaviest around March or April, where we'd expect it to require a day or two a week perhaps for about a 3-week span as you begin to interact and test with possible solutions. We do understand that there are some funds available for travel if necessary for participation, and we're examining other alternatives in case there were a need for any IT support.
All right, thank you very much, Regina. The next question we have is the plan for this to replace the current NEI EIS?
This is Ron Evans, and this particular activity is not going to replace the current NEI EIS. Now, within the space of the CARE project that I mentioned earlier, what is being considered is looking at the NEI EIS, which is EPA's system in cooperation with the states for developing a national emissions inventory, and folding that into the operation with 3 other EPA programs, specifically looking at GHGs, the TRI, and also a compliance reporting system that we have here. So it's not to replace, that CARE project is not to replace, but it is to integrate the emissions reporting across those 4 programs and focus on the state input that comes through the NEI and EIS system as well.
Hey, Ron, can I add to that? I'd also like to say that one thing people need to keep in mind is that facility integration, the facility team, is specifically focused on facility level topics that span across programs of the EPA. The question about the EIS being replaced with, I suppose, the FRS data model is very specific to that program and is not within the scope of the facility team, if that helps at all.
All right, thanks, Ron and Josh. The next question we have is the air facility model that is going to be used as a starting point. Is that something that can be shared now?
I'll go ahead and answer that one. The goal of having a facility model, they may need to follow up with what they mean on air facility model, but I believe they are interpreting that to be that the programs that report various air emissions has some kind of cross-program facility model in place, and there currently exists none. That's the focus of phase 2, is to identify that model using the information from phase 1 and the input received from the Combined Air Emission Reporting Group on what their needs are for that program.
And this is Ron Evans. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, sorry. And so I'd just say, this is Matt from the FRS team. If you're talking model at the database level, then we've taken EIS, EIA 860, as well as RTR data, and have that be as, let's just call it phase 1 of the new data model. And so we'll be supporting the facility needs for those 3 programs. And from there, we'll be able to work with individual programs to evaluate their requirements and make appropriate modifications to the data model. And we built it in a way that changes will be easy to make and easy to scale up.
All right, thanks. The next question is, will this effort include an update to facility site identification data and latitude-longitude data standards as they currently exist?
As we work through user stories and business rules, that's a possibility, and we'll be working closely with the existing FRS model. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, sure. I'd say I can very well see a version of the FAC ID flow coming out as a product of this project. We'll call it 4.0, and this includes the ability to flow sub-facility component data to FRS, not just summing things up at the facility level. But on the lat-long question, I think we'll definitely need to evaluate all the different options there, and so we're going to be moving forward with how we're currently managing lat-long data in FRS, but if there's a need to really explore other conventions or specifications, then I think that's on the table.
All right, thanks for those clarifications. I'm not seeing any other questions right now in the chat. Maybe or on the questions box. Maybe I'll give folks another moment or two here in case there's any other questions remaining.
Jimmy, I see one question here about, it says it would be really good to interview a couple of states that don't currently use the exchange network for their RCRA reporting. They would have a different perspective that will be important to capture. And we certainly agree that is true. What we've done and are doing through phase 2 here is going ahead and using the AIR program as a base to begin. And we fully recognize that the RCRA program, water programs, and others will all have issues that are likely to be different from some of those presented by the AIR program. But what we're hoping to do is, through this first phase, be able to go ahead and get, maybe an 80% solution or better in terms of dealing with many of the issues, and then we'll bring in representatives from other programs and other media to go ahead and take that different perspective that is going to help us. Now, to be sure, as we're moving forward with our efforts here, we will be reaching out to people outside of the AIR program to test some of the bigger business rules and such. And there will be a separate process that Matt referred to in terms of sharing of the EPA data model that we think that people from a broader view will be able to have the access to and be able to see how that works as well. So we certainly agree that the perspectives of other programs and other media is important. It's just we're starting with AIR.
And this is Susan Jones. Just to add to what Ron said, in terms of our user stories and business rules, and Ron touched on this, we want to be as comprehensive as possible. So to the question about the state perspective of recurrent reporting, that's very valuable, and we hope to capture that in the user stories, recognizing that we'll have a big backlog of things we can't necessarily address in this phase, but we are trying to be as comprehensive as possible. So bringing the perspective of RCRA and other programs to the user stories and business rules, so we can begin to be comprehensive in capturing that information.
In addition, the MDM pilot, where a state already has something in place, we would assume that what they have in place more than likely has multiple programs, air, water, land and waste management, including information that would be observed. So we do hope in that sense we'll also pick up some additional information about other topical areas beyond air.
Also, I'd like to, just in case anyone's confused about it, the participants that we hope for within Phase 2 aren't specific to programs within air quality at various states of the EPA. We're hoping for as many media types as possible or experiences as possible, just to be aware of the variance across states and EPA with the various programs. So if you're water, if you're land, and you're interested in participating in one of the work streams, obviously other than the South Carolina pilot one, feel free to contact us.
All right, thanks everyone. I think that is about all the time we have for today. Thanks for everybody for attending. Thanks to the co-chairs for their presentations and answering all these excellent questions that we've gotten. If you've answered a question and we haven't been able to address it here, we will add it to a list that we can track and keep on the SharePoint site, which is the facility team SharePoint site within the Enterprise for the Environment SharePoint site. So thanks again, and you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on the SharePoint site that I just mentioned as well.